Hello, my name is Josh Brumberg. I'm the Dean for the Sciences here at the Graduate Center. When thinking about the pandemic, we're all looking for silver linings. One such example is tonight's webinar, which was originally envisioned as an in-person event, but like so many things, got put on hold. So I'm delighted to welcome a larger crowd online than we could have hosted in the Skylight Room at the Graduate Center for the resumption of our City of Science series, where we explore science and its implications from the lab to, in tonight's case, the comic book, as we explore the science of superheroes. As a public university, the Graduate Center and its associated Advanced Science Research Center are committed to the idea that our scientific research has a role in advancing the public good. To help us answer the question, could superheroes and their powers exist? I'm delighted to introduce our two panelists. First, Dr. Shane Campbell-Staton, who is an assistant professor of biology at UCLA, where he studies how climate change is impacting living organisms and how they are evolving as a result. For the past 3 years, he has hosted the Biology of Superheroes podcast, and at UCLA has used topics from comics to teach biology in a class aptly called The Biology of Superheroes. Next, we have Dr. Sebastian Alvarado, who is an assistant professor of biology at Queens College and here at the Graduate Center. Dr. Alvarado's research focuses on how species such as fish adapt to changes in their environment. Most relevant for tonight's discussion, he is the author of the book, The Science of Marvel. Before turning the virtual microphone over to Sebastian, a few words about how this evening will progress. We'll open up with the discussion between Shane and Sebastian, and then we will leave about 15 minutes for questions from you, the audience. So please write your questions into the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, and I will pick a few up to ask at the end. My job is done for now, and I'm going to join all of you in listening to Sebastian and Shane guide us through what I'm sure will be a fascinating conversation. So as they say, kapow, the science of superheroes. Enjoy.
Awesome. All right.
Oh, you just muted yourself, Sebastian.
Sorry about that. So this is it. We made it this far. We worked so hard. We got our PhDs. We were able to hide under the radar, and now we finally get to come out. Not that we were hiding it before, but we get to talk about comic books and science. It's about time.
Oh, yeah.
I'm excited. So we're going to talk about everything. I guess we're focusing mainly on the Marvel Cinematic Universe. We've got our enthusiasm, our passion for the work and the creative works of Marvel. I have my action figures. I don't know, I think what we were going to start with was Shane and I were just going to kind of talk about the most feasible and then slowly tiptoe towards the more extraordinary of ideas and things that we've seen. And I think just because a lot of thoughts and sentiments towards the role of the Black Panther that was played by Chadwick Boseman and his recent passing, it's rather recent. We thought maybe we'd start with some Black Panther. I don't know, did you want to get us started, Shane, on anything?
Yeah, so actually I wanted to start with a question for you.
Okay.
Which came first for you, right? Your love of science or your love of comic books?
Well, now that I made it this far, it's definitely my love of comic books. I felt that the unsafe answer before would be to say that at a job interview. But now it's definitely, a lot of my interest in science stemmed from a passion about science fiction in general. And then from there, it was a very easy way to make the science interesting for me. How about you?
So I actually didn't get into comic books until pretty late. It was actually like during my PhD that I got into, I like bought my first comic book in my dissertation writing year. I was completely burnt out and I just needed something to read that would help me kind of turn my brain off. So I bought a copy of Superman versus Muhammad Ali. And then I started having all these weird dreams where, you know, it's like the science and all the superhero stuff started merging together. And that's how I got started.
For me, it was sneaking into my brother's room. So he collected comic books and my parents didn't allow me to read them because they were violent and things like that. He had a bunch of manga and he had like a whole run of the Wolverine original series. And I wasn't allowed to read them, and he definitely didn't want me near it. So I had both forces, my parents and my brother, working against me. But I broke into his room, I snuck into his closet, and I hid in the closet, and I took them out of their little plastic wrapping, and that's where it all started for me. And then I guess continued from there, taking breaks away from school and things like that to read comic books and then kind of go back to school. But yeah, no, I mean, it's been really fun. And I think it's been really interesting in the last like 10 to 15 years to see all of the biggest blockbusters all of a sudden become comic books. My kids are being raised in a world where that's the norm. And for me growing up as a kid, like I was a loser because I like comic books at that age. And I was not like, that was not a talking point that you would use to impress people.
Yeah, there's a stigma about it for a while, definitely.
Yeah.
Look at us now.
Look at us now.
Yeah, so I think, for me, the thing with comic books and the intersection with science, like you mentioned this idea that is actually the science fiction that got you into the science in a way. And the same is true for me, not so much with the comic books, but with, like the Spider-Man TV show on Fox I used to watch as a kid, like seeing this dude, Peter Parker, who, he gets bit by this radioactive spider, and now he has all these superpowers, but he could have just left it at that. It's like, I'm strong, I'm fast, I can climb on walls, I'm just gonna do my thing. And he would have been some variant of, I don't know, I guess like Captain America or something like that. But that's not what he did. He took it a step further and he used his scientific acumen. I mean, he was a very talented, scientist, even as a high school kid. And, he designs these web shooters, designs this web fluid, and it becomes a fundamental part of who he is as a character. So the idea that, science plays such a huge role in his life, and obviously the lives of a lot of other characters. You have, Bruce Banner, Hank Pym, like all of these different people. I mean, I think that connection is always, it's there and it's natural. And then on the science side of things, I think it's also natural in a way because it's essentially a thought experiment, right? And thought experiments, I think, are an underappreciated, but actually a really, really important part of the scientific process. I mean, you take something like Schrodinger's cat, like people use that as an example all the time, where you have this weird zombie cat in a box and it's both alive and dead when the box is closed, and then you open it up and figure out which one, it is. And the concept, right, is really useful for understanding like this really, like the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum superposition is like really complicated aspect of physics. But the example is absolutely absurd. And I feel like nobody really appreciates the absurdity of it, but it's useful. So in the same way, I think comic books are really useful for really digging deep into science, and not only just the science, but why it's important.
Definitely. And there are a lot of ways. I mean, we probably see this in the classroom, and I do it as well, where it's kind of like, you could talk about DNA repair mechanisms and base excision repair, nucleotide excision repair, which are words that are probably kind of really good at losing an audience. But we could also talk about DNA damage in terms of exposure to gamma rays, right? We actually have developed all kinds of mutants in molecular biology that we've used to study all kinds of genetics by bombarding plants with gamma radiation, as well as other mutagens. And when you hear gamma radiation and DNA damage, all of a sudden you start thinking about characters like this guy, right? You think about the actual, the Incredible Hulk, the Abomination, movies that probably 3 out of 4 people in any audience have seen, I'm hoping, or maybe not, right, definitely at least have heard of. And everyone knows what the Incredible Hulk is. So all of a sudden you have this common ground to talk about these really abstract, very like kind of rabbit hole academic areas that are very hard to get people maybe engaged in sometimes. And all of a sudden, because of the Incredible Hulk, that's something you can talk about, right? So that's something I get really excited about. It's a common language that we can use to share our science and the science of others as well.
Awesome. Let's do it, man.
All right.
So for me, I know you're a Marvel guy, And so we're going to explore the Marvel Universe. For those of you who are listening, and you're like, oh, I want you to talk about DC stuff. Sorry, you can curse us out in the chat box. But I think we're going to stick pretty much to Marvel on this. Huh?
DC will sponsor the next event.
Okay. So, you know, if we're exploring this Marvel Universe, I think it's natural to start with the Avengers, just because, you know, the cinematic universe revolves around the Avengers. And if I'm thinking about the Avengers, obviously I can think about them in like different classes, right? So you have, you know, the ground level heroes as I think about them. So you have like Black Widow and Hawkeye, right? Who are these sort of elite athletes. And then you have, you know, the folks who rely on technology, like, you know, Iron Man and Winter Soldier and Falcon. And then you have, you know, at the heavy hitters, you know, you have like Thor and the Hulk. And I think in each of these characters, there's something to explore. And I know you've written a little bit about, in your book, you've written about Hawkeye, at least. I was wondering, so like, when you think about Hawkeye as a character, what are the things biologically that like pop out to you?
So he's one of those characters, kind of like Daredevil and others, that are very much just humans. There's really almost nothing that super about them. I mean, I know to a certain extent in the lore, they kind of said they got like medium versions of the super soldier serum that kind of made them, you know, age a bit slower. But for at least what it's worth, shooting a bow and arrow isn't something that humans don't know how to do, right? It's something that we've obviously seen developed in our culture and in various other cultures in all kinds of interesting ways, with different types of bow styles and the way people shoot bows, the way different, you know, how the bow and arrow has been used for military might across the ages. And when it comes to the science, we're really just kind of exploring motor skills, human motor skills and some motor skill neuroscience. So whenever you think about that, you're thinking about information entering the eye, going through the optic nerve to the back of your brain, and then rewiring to some sort of motor skill that has to be done. Now, I know enough about archery based off of having tried it for about a few months, which is not enough to be good at archery, but let's say it's enough to talk about archery. And it's one of those things where you really train your body to become very, very accurate at carrying out a specific motion. So my understanding, the best archers are very capable of copying their body movements perfectly each time to get a shot with high accuracy. So when they're teaching you at the very beginning, even if you're hitting the same edge of a bullseye, that's still very good because your body's very good at memorizing where exactly to hit. So really you just have to train your body and your eyes to look at the bullseye a little bit closer. But the ability to narrow the window of what you are hitting is really what builds your neuroplasticity and your skill level. And one thing that I kind of discovered, yeah.
So this is the difference between like precision versus accuracy, right? It's like
right, or just a combination or consideration of both of them, right? It's the idea of being able to hit that same spot multiple times. One thing that I thought was kind of neat, and one thing that I really didn't think about, because aside from my amateur archery lessons that my wife got for me, I thought that was really neat in my research for this book, that there's this interesting phenomenon called the quiet eye phenomena, which is a pause that a lot of expert athletes take before carrying out a very complex motor task. And they literally call it the quiet eye because it's this pause that they take between doing something. So it's that idea of pulling back, the bow, and then almost processing what is going to happen before it happens, and then taking the shot. And what many different research groups have found, specifically in the area in the fields of kinesiology, they found that a lot of athletic performance can sometimes be enhanced by paying attention to that quiet eye training. So basically taking a minute to pause, take a deep breath, and then let's say shoot a basketball hoop or release an arrow. And that was something that I thought was really neat, because when you look at expert or Olympic athletes, this was a recurring phenomenon, whether you're a snooker player, or a basketball player, or an archer, or whatever. If it's a complex motor skill, there's always this type of cognitive processing that happens before the task that leads up to it. And being able to work on that window, it's kind of the work that gets done in the brain before the actual outcome happens. And I figured that was something to work in really well into Hawkeye's, ability to do a lot of things. Of course, we have to take that with a grain of salt, because there's a lot of stuff that he does that really obeys the rule of cool, as opposed to any real science. Like, he's like jumping off of the back of a skyscraper and then shooting the arrow, and then it hits something, and it's one of those impossible shots. And when you think about it and how it actually happens, when it comes to peak human condition and skills like that, it has to be something he's practiced, right? It has to be something that he's done thousands and thousands and thousands of times to have that muscle memory, to have that cognitive ability to carry out those tasks. So maybe at SHIELD, he's constantly practicing and jumping off of the corner of a table, falling to the ground and practicing that shot, in which case, good for him. I mean, that's how the Parthenian shot was mastered, right? Among archers that in various armies, and where you kind of hang off the back of a horse and you shoot behind you. That's something that you don't just do because you want to look cool and want to impress a bunch of people. It's something that you train your entire life for, to develop that skill. So you would almost imagine that Hawkeye is practicing when no one's watching him be cool or making snark remarks to every other Avenger there. At least that's how I see it. I don't know.
But the cool just comes along with it, after all of the practice. But that's interesting. Right. So, even so, when we think about, when I'm thinking about these characters, someone like Hawkeye or Black Widow, or Daredevil, there is, this idea of like proprioception, like trying to understand like your body's position with respect to the environment around you. And obviously a lot of that has to do with how your inner ear is moving and how your brain is able to interpretate the movements of your inner ear in order to orient yourself. And obviously for humans, like doing something like you said is absurd, right? Like you could take that shot 10,000 times and you probably wouldn't make it. I certainly wouldn't make it. You got more training than me, so maybe you'd make it at least once.
I definitely know I cannot.
But if you look, as an evolutionary biologist, I always like to look at these things in a comparative framework, right? And you don't have to get too far away from us on the phylogenetic tree, right? To get to creatures that actually process like super complex environments in amazing ways, right? Like if you think about a lot of the arboreal primates, for instance, these are animals like from a very, very young age are moving through incredibly complex environments, swinging from branches, analyzing, almost instantaneously, like, is this a branch I can actually grab a hold of that's not going to break? If you do grab a hold of it and it breaks, then instantaneously reacting, to find something else to hold on, like while you're moving. And, in the case of a Hawkeye, he misses a shot, he just, pulls out another arrow from his quiver. But, if you're a capuchin monkey and you miss a branch, that might be the difference between life and death. All right. So what that gets me to is this idea that like, so you open this up saying that these characters are more or less like, they're just kind of, people, it's, they're like really good at what they do, but at the end of the day, they're just people. And for me, that brings up the question is like, we at the very least can consider these people elite athletes, right? And so then the question is, are elite athletes actually just normal people who train really hard? Or is there something genetically different that allows some individuals to accomplish things that most of us just can't do? And I think when you look at populations of athletes, it turns out that there are some genetic variants that occur at much higher frequencies in elite athletes than occur in other, the broader population. And those, have to do with obviously height, right? There's a classic term like you can't train tall, but then there's also, genes that are involved in muscle physiology and muscle composition, et cetera. So in a real way, even a character like a Hawkeye or Black Widow, we can consider in a very real way a mutant, right? In the sense that there are specific mutations.
Yeah, definitely. Actually, I think there's two dimensions to it, right? There's that genetic where you kind of start with. It's that baseline that you kind of get from your parents, and that doesn't change throughout your life. And then there's also that environmental component that interacts with your genetics. I'm doing a shameless plug here because this is an area of the field that I specifically work in, right? We study, our group and in our lab, we work on the epigenetic mechanisms that shape how behavior and pigmentation changes in nature. So for us, it's a lot about the environment and assuming that nothing genetic changes for our work, but it's also an important way of finding, it's just basically an intersection of these two things, right? So in a natural population of humans, there are definitely a ton of very cool mutants that differentiate those who can, let's say, hold their breath longer underwater, those who can carry more oxygen in their blood, those that can make very good marathon runners because they have a genetic predisposition to having the muscle tone of a marathon runner versus the muscle tone of somebody who sprints. And there are tons of really cool studies looking at the genetics of that. That's one dimension. There's also the environmental component, right? There are all kinds of ways in which we interact with our environment. If I don't drink any milk throughout my childhood, I won't be as tall as I am now, right? There are ways of affecting our environment through nutrition. There are ways of affecting our environment through our social interactions, our childhood. There are ways in which just the toxicology of our surrounding environment can tell us and tell our tissues which genes need to be turned on and turned off at different times. And that is something that you can think a lot about these Avengers, right? Avengers like the Black Widow, she's somebody who went through this spy training, this traumatic experience in her childhood that made her a killing machine. We never saw the movie; it didn't get released because of the pandemic. But I'm sure that it's going to visit that childhood, right? What made her the hero she became, or what made her the killer that she became, that then turned into the hero that she became with the Avengers. Similarly, there are ways in which you can borrow that environmental paradigm and combine it with genetic changes when it comes to the transformation of a lot of heroes. The human-like ones, kind of like our Stephen Rogers, our Captain America, who is this scrawny, small kid from Brooklyn who got the super soldier serum, and then all of a sudden he grew in height and grew muscles, and he was ready to fight the Nazis. So there's all kinds of, like, you have to consider there are more than one ways in addition to the genetics. Not to say that we haven't learned anything from the genetics. We've learned everything from genetics for the last 50 years. But I guess I'm excited about this environmental component, just because that's what I study.
And it's the combination of the two, right? I mean, it is, right, these are two parts of a whole, right? Like, so you can take, if Hawkeye, for instance, has a genetic mutation that just allows him, for whatever reason, to be very precise, with a given shot, but you sit him on a couch until he's 25 and then just throw him into a suit and say, now go be a superhero, you don't get the same result. Right? And as an evolutionary biologist, right, this is also brings me to, like, the sort of next stage when we look at, like, for instance, the Black Panther, right, where, he's an individual who is, who is also very naturally, gifted. He's very elite. And part of that, is likely genetics. Part of that comes from the environment with the heart-shaped herb, and those two combine to create the hero that we see. Now, it's interesting because, even when we're talking about elite athletes, a lot of times, right, these mutations that are, floating around in these populations, they don't just pop up at random, right? These are typically variants in our genomes that have been shaped by the process of evolution. When you have, the genetic blueprint that is then, set in an environment not just for an individual's life, but over the lives of multiple generations. Now, all of a sudden, evolution by natural selection begins to push that mutation to become more abundant in a population, right? And we see that, I think, with the Wakandans, right? So, we see when, for instance, when aliens invade Wakanda, what we see is something very different from when aliens invaded New York City, right? It's Black Panther that comes out, right? Wakandans take up arms and, they fight, they, line up with the Avengers and go out and, protect this place that they live in. And, a big part of that, I think, has to do with this combination of environment and culture and genetics, right? So I think one of the things in Marvel lore is that, anyone who is Wakandan, right, can take the heart-shaped herb. Anyone can challenge for the title of Black Panther, take the heart-shaped herb and become the Black Panther. But if you're not Wakandan and you take that herb, it's a death sentence, right? So it's toxic, which suggests to me that there's like some very specific genetic variant floating around within the Wakandan population, right, that bestows upon them like some resistance to the toxic effects, right, and allows them to get whatever the beneficial effects are.
I'm going to posit that it's probably one of these cytochrome enzyme complexes that you have in your liver, right, that detoxify toxins, right? Because you have a bunch of, and there's I'm going to go down off this tangent because it sounds like fun, but like there are genetic variants in several different detoxifying enzymes that exist in your liver that actually dictate how human populations react to different types of medication, depending on mutations in different cytochrome P450 complexes, which are these detoxifying enzymes. People who can take one dose or take the general dose will not react to a specific medication, whereas those that have a mutation and take that certain dose, it might be lethal to them in the fact that it might be too much for them, depending, of course, what exactly is in this purple herb. But it is definitely true, right? If only Wakandans can take it, there's got to be some sort of important allele that's kept within that population that we could figure out by sequencing them and doing a GWAS study. Maybe.
Exactly. Yeah,
but they don't talk about that in movies. Yeah,
that's true. That's true. Man, I had a point and I lost it. What was it? So even like when you're talking about differences in in drug efficacy, like amongst individuals, right? I mean, this is not something that just plays out at random. Like a lot of times, race and ethnicity, demography, right? This shared history plays a role in it. For instance, which is why it's so important to have representation in things like the Human Genome Project, right? Because, if you're focusing on a single demographic, a single population, a single sex, the results may be very different, when you look at other individuals because of like different gene by environment interactions.
That is a huge blind spot that it seems that in the last decade, we've all of a sudden realized, oh, it turns out we shouldn't be just looking at this one population when it comes to developing, drugs and fixing specific diseases. I'm in total agreement. It's something that I think is getting better though. In the last decade, there's been a lot more light cast on the genetics population. Some of it has been commercially driven by companies like 23andMe. Others have been more academically driven, but it's definitely, hopefully, turning into a better future.
Yeah.
A personalized medicine, I assume. One thing that I want to talk about, because we talked about already, and I thought it was a really fun conversation, is specifically with the Black Panther and this gene environment thing. It's a thought experiment that we talked about on your podcast, but also that I mentioned in my book. And it's that idea that we've got this beautiful example of nurture and nature in the Black Panther, in the first Black Panther movie, where you have T'Challa and you have Killmonger as these opposing forces that are, fighting with one another throughout the course of this movie. And it's interesting because that they come from the same blood. They are genetically Wakandans. They are pretty much coming from the same family, so you know that there might be genetic differences, but even within that family, they can't be that different, right?
They're cousins.
But this, they're cousins, yeah, they're cousins. And based off of that, though, it's all about the early childhood environment that made them completely different people. And it couldn't be more different for each of them, right? In one case, you have somebody who is quite, well, they're both royalty, but this one is quite literally a prince, right? He gets the best education in the entire world. He gets the best food in the entire world. They're literally, once we got introduced to Wakanda and Black Panther, we realized, hey, everything's better in Wakanda, right? So when it comes to privilege status, it doesn't get better than being the Prince of Wakanda. And on the other hand, you have Killmonger's story, where his father is killed right in front of him in Oakland in the 80s. There's a lot of crime. There's a lot of things going on that would make it very, very difficult for him to get to the point where he is at the beginning of that movie. And a lot of that, if we just take a step away from the genetics, has everything to do with environment. It motivates the story. The fact that, what if T'Challa and Killmonger had switched places? Would the story be the exact same story? And that's something that I like asking, because it really makes you wonder, well, had T'Challa had to deal with his father being killed in front of him by his uncle, of all people, how would he feel about that? How would he have grown up in America versus going back to Wakanda? And I always feel that that's a very interesting place to start when it comes to these stories and thought experiments and the science, because it actually reminds me of work that that motivated me to do my PhD when I was in graduate school at McGill. I went to a lab, Moshe Sif's lab, where they had just finished publishing this study where they looked at licking and grooming among rats, where they had a strain of rats that licked and groomed their pups and a strain of rats that didn't. And that was able to change the way genes were being expressed in the brain of those offspring. And then that led to behaviors that manifested later in life that had to do a lot more with anxiety and things like that. And like you mentioned, there's this variation that genetically exists within a population, but there are all these environmental triggers that can program gene function and therefore behavioral function and brain function down the road. And then what's really cool, and again, we talked about it and I mentioned it, but there's also in that variation of those that find themselves subject to being, let's say, more stressed and more anxious, there's always a small subset within that population that are capable of resisting, that are capable of rising against adversity. And specifically in a very similar mouse model, there are actually some studies that were done in the Weizmann Institute looking at the stress axis and which genes get turned on and respond to a stressful stimuli. And after screening tons and tons of animals where this is a very typical response, where if they get aggressed, they eventually become subordinated, there was this 5 to 10% that didn't. And they were able to tie to some of these epigenetic differences in the brain. So for me, that was kind of like, just like Killmonger did, right? Because he was in that very adversarial environment, but he rose above it and he became, he may have been a villain, although I would even argue, was he really a villain? I mean, there's this really neat storytelling, and it's a different question, right? But there's very neat storytelling where he becomes the antagonist, let's say, of this story, purely based off of that environmental interaction, one that we've kind of modeled in labs, and we've actually seen how it changes the brain and things like that. So that I like that so much. It's really cool, and I'm glad we can still talk about it, especially after the recent passing of Chadwick Boseman. But anyways, I don't know, like if there was more that you kind of wanted to add to that, and if anything you wanted to talk about.
Well, I think sort of in progressing the conversation along, right, the other side of Wakanda is, the Black Panther, there are the physical gifts, right, of the individual, but then there's also the technology that he has access to, that really makes him a hero, like makes him the Black Panther, right? This like super high tech suit, access to this very, rare mineral in vibranium. And obviously the technological advancements of Wakanda are absolutely ridiculous. And I think that to me brings to mind, right, these heroes that actually use technology, right, as the basis of, of their powers, right? It becomes like the core of who they are as heroes. And obviously, like Tony Stark, for instance, always comes to mind because, his armor, well, the arc reactor that, powers his armor, it's not just, a power source. It's very literally a prosthetic. It's the thing that keeps him alive. So thinking about, these sorts of characters, I think is also interesting, and sort of, moving beyond just the genetic part and moving into the tech. So I think my question for you is, are there specific heroes that sort of lie in this tech world, that you find particularly interesting for some reason?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the, we've got the Winter Soldier, right? He's got a cybernetic arm that he can, that he lost in that unfortunate train accident in the first Captain America movie. And he pretty much had to learn how to use an arm again, if you think about it, right? Because now that it's gone, how does the brain talk to its limbs? Is really the question that gets asked. And the brain almost has to learn how to use a new limb in a completely different way. And in preparing those parts of the book, I learned a lot about, brain-computer interfaces. And, you hear about it in the news, you hear about certain people going around talking, they're going to make a neural lace that they're going to inject into your brain and everything's going to be great. And you don't need to know neuroscience to talk about it. I don't know if anybody knows what I'm talking about. But the idea is that it's this really interesting idea because, and this is something I've actually learned a lot more from my wife, Maral Tajarian, because she's the neuroscientist. But it's really learning how the brain processes information and really understanding what are the extents at which it can process information with that technology. So when I was writing about this arm that the Winter Soldier has, I was really learning about how it's not easy, but there are a handful of examples of people who have lost limbs, or people who lost limbs early in their life or later in their life. And one thing that I thought was really neat is that there is this case of somebody, I believe she was an aid worker, I might be wrong, but she had lost her arm, and she's in Chicago, I believe. But what they did is they actually mapped the cybernetic prosthesis to her muscles in her chest. And the whole idea was to retrain the brain to remap basically how the brain has already mapped a real arm onto your brain, so that way you can use it to manipulate objects, but then relearning those processes through your chest. So in a way, this person had to tense up parts of their chest in a way that allows articulation in the arm and the elbow and the thing. So it's a completely different way of thinking, which really is a testament to how plastic the brain is and how much it can change. So for me, that metallic arm is something that always kind of comes into the back of my head, like, oh, it couldn't have been that easy for him, right? It's just all of a sudden to thaw and things like that. But
it's like a very extreme version of like being right-handed your entire life and then trying to switch to being exclusively left-handed. I don't know if anybody has ever tried to write with their off-dominant hand before and just like write a letter, but it is incredibly hard and difficult and actually painful to do. It actually hurts.
I'm gonna massacre this example. I know that there are probably a handful of neuroscientists in the audience. I know my wife is one of them. But there was this experiment and this idea where I think if you wear these goggles that kind of turn your vision upside down, and if you wear them long enough, you get used to it, and your brain gets used to processing the information upside down. And if you remove them, now the way you see the world is upside down. So it's kind of like your brain has been tricked over time to adjust and adapt to a specific way of processing information in your environment. And that's one way you can trick your brain, or your brain can adapt and change. So it's really pushing the limits of how the brain works, with your arm, with a mechanical suit. I believe there's more to it than just him with his fingertips in that Iron Man suit, figuring out how to do all these incredibly complicated things. There's probably a handful of, detection systems where his body's intentions are being processed and read by the machine to adjust and accommodate for, you know, subtle movements. So there's that very basic, I'm going to punch, the machine punches for me. I'm going to turn my head and the machine turns for me. That's kind of this, you know, very basic form of just a natural behavior, an innate behavior. But when things get a little bit more complicated, such as take me to altitude 65,000 feet, shoot me into space, and you know what I mean, and shoot this nuclear warhead, or like shoot these kinds of missiles, or put me in touch with my giant Hulkbuster armor across the world, like those kinds of things, obviously, that's something where if you ask me just to answer an email, it takes me a few minutes to find that email and then, you know, write it and then reply to it. And I think that is definitely easier than doing those very complex tasks. So there's got to be something more to it. I'm expecting that Iron Man probably has some sort of brain-computer interface in addition to that arc reactor that helps him with his tasks. I don't know.
And I think that has to be the case. And I think we get a little bit of a hint, you know, when we see those moments when we see like his face, you know, in the suit, and, you know, he's looking at this screen, and there's like all of these different components that he's, you know, that he's sort of looking at and processing simultaneously. And
eye tracking too.
Yeah, so there is like a non-invasive, you know, brain-computer interfacing that uses like movements of the eye in order to process information. Now, obviously, at least the versions that I have seen are nowhere near as complicated as what we see with Tony Stark. But then again, Tony Stark is a genius, so it's not, you know, all that surprising that he
does everything by himself too.
Yeah.
We're suckers, right? We've got teams of people working for us, and we have to get our grants. Tony Stark's already got it figured out.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think, you know, in continuing, you know, with this idea, you know, there is, right, so, you know, we've gone from biology, you know, into the technology, but there's also like this area that like sits right at the interface between these two, which is, you know, biologically inspired engineering, right? Like using, you know, components, using solutions that natural selection has come up with, that biodiversity has come up with, in order to design things that are useful for humans. And I think Spider-Man is a, you know, a key part, you know, he's like, you know, absolutely perfect example of this with his webbing. Sorry, are we out of time? Did we nerd out?
This has been great, and actually, I was trying to get in right when you said Tony Stark. What I don't know if you guys know, but maybe we got in the Q&A. One of our viewers reminded me that Jon Favreau, who is kind of the mastermind behind the Iron Man movie, was a Queens College student for 3 years.
Yeah.
So that's to bring it back here to CUNY, and this has been a great discussion, and I think several people really have gotten into the spirit of what this is about tonight. So I want to hit you with a couple of questions from our audience.
Awesome.
All right, so this is, I'm going to read it. The fact that mutant powers manifest themselves around puberty suggests that sex-specific steroids act as transcription factors for the mutant proteins. Why then do mutant powers not wane with the natural reduction in levels of these hormones that occur through the normal aging process? Magneto and Dr. X, I think that's who Xavier is, for example, are powerful later in life as they were younger. So I think that really captures the spirit of today's discussion.
Yeah. Do you want to take that, Sebastian?
I'm happy to take. So I'm gonna say this much. I was in 2007 when I finished undergraduate, my undergraduate degree. So the example of that, the mice that change their behavior based off of maternal licking and grooming, and which genes get turned on and turned off. That experiment, when I heard about it on the radio, was what got me to apply to that PhD lab, to that lab for my PhD. And it was that thinking, that exact idea that there must have been something happening in that mutant early adversity, early childhood adversity that triggered which genes get turned on and turned off. So for me back then, I knew a lot less about genetics, and I said it's the X gene because that's what they said in the comic books, because that was where I was working off of. But exactly that type of thinking. It's that thinking that there is some sort of signaling cascade related to stress that is probably at peak levels when transcription factors, which are these, for those in the audience that are maybe less familiar with that, where you have these proteins that specifically bind to your DNA and they help turn on and turn off specific genes when you need them or when your body needs them. And there are obviously peaks of these transcription factors that are more functional during puberty, which happens to be a convenient window where these X-Men get their powers. So I'm just in agreement with the thought because I had it in 2007 when I decided to do my PhD. Of course, I did not say that to my then PhD advisor. I can say it now, but I can't say it then. But yeah. I don't know, Shane, if you want
to comment on that, Shane?
Yeah. So two things that I'll add, right, is that, you know, when you're talking about, essentially what we're talking about is this idea of plasticity, right? The, you know, gene by environment interactions, right? And your body responding to an environment to produce a different phenotype. That's typically what we call plasticity. And there are multiple types of plasticity, right? So for instance, some plasticity is reversible, but some is irreversible, right? So there's things that happen that get turned on early in life. You know, it may be that those differences that get turned on at puberty for mutants are irreversible changes, you know, and that even without the signal, now all of a sudden, like, those changes are fixed throughout an individual's life. The other possibility is that, you know, maybe the X gene is actually, like, not the only gene responsible for powers, right? So when we think about, you know, eye color or, you know, pigmentation, right? Typically there's, like, you know, one gene or maybe a couple of genes that are involved, but for most phenotypes that we're interested in, a lot of things that we've been talking about, like drug resistance, aspects of physiology and performance, there are an entire suite of genes that work together in order to produce, you know, whatever the function happens to be. So it could be that, you know, for instance, there may be another gene, right, that is inherited along with the X gene that maybe continues to produce hormones at an abnormally high level throughout an individual's life, right? And it's the combination of those two things, you know, that that bestow powers to an individual.
All right, here's what I thought was a really interesting question is, does science lose value in a universe where magic, like Doctor Strange, exists alongside Iron Man's scientific advances?
Does it lose value? I don't think so. Because the thing is, right, even in a scenario, even in a universe where magic exists, some aspect of physics has to apply, right? Now, the rules of physics in that universe may be somehow fundamentally different than they are in our universe, but, you know, nevertheless, right, if given the opportunity, given enough resources and given enough manpower, the scientists in the Marvel universe may very well figure out what the physics behind, you know, magic is.
I'd also like to point out that Kevin Feige, when he and the creative team at Marvel started blueprinting the Marvel Cinematic Universe at the very beginning, in the way that they pitched Thor, which is one of these very first few magical characters, they even use the line in the movie that there is a certain level of scientific achievement that itself could look like magic. For example, if you were to take this room and this event and rewind it 200 years and show it to, you know, a group of humans 200 years ago, they would see it as magic. And that's something they tried to sell early on in order to buy them that suspension of disbelief in that universe, at least that's how I've seen it. In addition to that, they had their second form of magic come around with Ant-Man, and that was the use of quantum mechanics. And for anybody who's a quantum mechanics scientist in the audience, I'm sorry. But there was that type of, I personally I was so disappointed with it. Well, not disappointed. I mean, it's definitely cool and it's definitely an entry point into the science. The reason I was disappointed was because I actually had shrunk ants in my work as a PhD student, and I actually made them bigger. So I was trying to pitch that science to Marvel when they were first making the Ant-Man movie, and I'm like, just do it. I can actually, look, they're not that much bigger. They're like twice as big. They're still ants, right? But the idea is that there is this second degree of magic, which was the quantum mechanics of Ant-Man and how he could shrink and enlarge himself with Pym particles. And I think that's something that they then borrowed again for this time travel paradigm in the more recent Avengers movies. And I think they're going to build off of it a little bit more when it comes to the Doctor Strange and this idea of alternative realities. So there is this type of magic, but it's not fantasy. It's magic with a flavor of science fiction, if we were kind of get really esoteric about all of it. So I always feel that they like to keep that type of science, even if it is magic. And I think they've navigated that space as best as you can with such incredible heroes and characters.
I know we're running a little bit low on time. Should we do some more rapid fire stuff?
Yeah, well, I got one. This is one more good question, and we could do a little rapid fire because I wanted to get to this one. You both talked about at the beginning about how you got into comic books, and one of our viewers wanted to know people like Stan Lee, what motivated them to create comic books, and then I would add the second proviso is, did they knowingly think out science in which they could work into their fantastical, like you were just mentioning, Sebastian?
So I think they were working with a lot of contemporary topics at the time. I mean, when you look at a lot of the radioactive spider, the gamma radiation, the Hulk, I mean, that was a decade where nuclear arms and warfare were at their peak in the news and the topics. When it came to the mutants in the 80s, it was about genetics, and that was a high point for genetic research. So they were always borrowing science from the time and the place. It works in a way, but it also kind of timestamps how dated the science could be. So, you know, early on with the X-Men and the mutants, it was, there's a gene. And it's true, back then, geneticists were like, there's a gene for everything, right? Now we're like, oh no, it's more complicated. We never said there's just one gene, right? As the epigenetics guy says in the room, I'll take all the heat for that one. But the idea is that they borrowed and they timestamped the ideas, and they were good for the time. And then it became difficult to break out of that mold as we learn more and more about the environment. They tried to develop it a little bit more, but as far as the science goes, they're always borrowing from the topics at the time. I think even like Luke Cage in the Netflix series, they borrowed CRISPR and gene editing to explain his super soldier serum. And of course now I'm sure quantum mechanics are getting this huge wave of interest, because now we have to try our best to understand ants and how they can shrink and enlarge themselves and things like that.
I would say the one exception where they got stuff, I think, right to a creepy degree is probably Captain America. All right, because, you know, with Captain America, you have these two components, right? You have the super soldier serum, and then you have these Vita rays. So you have to inject them with the super soldier serum and then expose them to these Vita rays in order to get this phenotype. And that is very similar to how a CRISPR-Cas9 system works, right? It's like you have, you know, a functional system that needs to be, you know, injected into an organism, but then you have to go through a process like electroporation in order to actually, you know, get it into the cells in order to get the phenotype that you're interested in. So the fact that they use this sort of combination of these two things in order to generate Captain America at a time, like, I think significantly before CRISPR-Cas9 was like even an idea, that always kind of freaks me out to think about.
For those of you who are more on the comic book side than the biology side, CRISPR-Cas9 is a way in which you can edit genes of an organism, and it was just awarded last month the Nobel Prize in Chemistry. So this is really quite an advance. So yeah, we only have like 2 or 3 minutes. So Shane, you want to, and Sebastian, you want to talk a little bit, you know, some closing comments, some thoughts?
This was fun. We should do it again.
Yeah, definitely. You know, I think for me, you know, it's, you know, the intersection of science and science fiction, I think is really interesting from both sides of the equation. I think is the thing, you know, that I have taken away from, you know, my exploration of the intersection of these, right? So on one hand, right, they feed each other in really interesting ways, right? Because on one hand, you know, comic books give you these really interesting thought experiments, right? They're very abstract, they're completely fiction, but, you know, in some cases give you the foundation to really explore in depth, you know, different biological, physical, scientific principles in a meaningful and deep way. Like the course that I teach on the biology of superheroes is an upper division course. So these are junior and senior biology majors in this course. So we actually go really deep into the biology in that case. And then I think the science actually, it deepens at least my appreciation of the characters that we see on the pages. Right? So, to have an understanding of the mechanisms and limitations and the biomechanics that are generating what you're seeing or what you're reading on a page, I think to me it just deepens the experience.
For me, it's been a really helpful place to motivate the questions that I ask and the science that I do. For the research that I do, I mean, I study an African cichlid from Lake Tanganyika, Asabs bertoni, which is this really interesting model for a lot of neurobiological changes and social behavior. The way that people sell this model is that males have a dominant and subordinate type. They can be one or the other depending on their social environment, and it changes their brain, it changes their color, it changes their behavior. The way I see it is I get to study a mini Incredible Hulk. When he ascends in social status and he becomes a dominant male, he changes color, just like the Hulk, right? He becomes super aggressive, just like the Hulk. He develops all these really interesting pigmentation patterns. The Hulk only has one of them. So if anything, I think my fish is a little bit more interesting, right? I get to open him up and look at his brain and see how those changes shape behavior. That's something I don't get to do with fictional characters, but it's something I get to do with the animals in my lab, the work that I get to do, and the questions I get to ask. So for me, it's this great place where I can start my interest in questions related to a field and how behavior and social behavior shapes behavior. Sorry, I said behavior to me, how social environment shapes behavior, but it's something that I can really sink my teeth into, and that's far more tangible and apparently of interest to a large community of neuroscientists. But for me, it started from a completely different place. So I feel that a lot of questions I normally wouldn't have asked, or collaborations that I wouldn't have normally initiated, or introductions to other scientists that I never would have made, stem from a lot of my interest in very disjointed topics, and I'm thankful for that. I'm thankful that I could unlike my competitors in my field, I can open a comic book, but do they have that issue? Can they compete with me if they have that type of information? Of course not, right? It's a very unique approach that I have to my science. I have a way of making it relevant to a research program, but for me, it's just more like, that's so cool. I wonder if I could do that in my lab. And that's something that I grew up always wanting to do, to make superheroes in my lab. I don't get to make a superhero in my lab, maybe not yet, but I'm getting pretty close in terms of the kinds of questions I get to ask and answer.
Well, I want to thank both of you for asking and answering some fascinating questions. For those who want to learn more, check out Shane's podcast, The Biology of Superheroes. I assume you could find it wherever you get your podcasts. And check out, there you go, Sebastian's book, The Science of Marvel. If you want to.
It's translated in Korean and Mandarin as well, for those of you who want to have
a wide audience. Until then, we all dream that we will find a superhero scientist to get us a vaccine. So the next time we do this, we can all be together at the Skylight Room. Until then, thanks everyone. Enjoy. Good night. Bye.
Thank you.
Take care.